Neoplatonism. By the middle of the 3rd century CE, the dominance of the Epicurean and Stoic schools had begun to wane, and a new movement of philosophical ideas was emerging, thinking of itself as Platonist, but in fact richly synthesizing itself from many of the strands of philosophy that had flourished in the 6 centuries since Plato's day. This new movement, which later scholars named Neoplatonism or New Platonism, provided a comprehensive view of the universe and humanity's relationship with that universe, which many people found satisfying and which in its latter phases became in effect a religion. As a religion, it was both an alternative to Christianity and a source of ideas for Christianity, which adopted and adapted a considerable amount from it. One reason for Neoplatonism's appeal, especially to educated people in the period of its chief flourishing between the 3rd and 7th centuries CE, is that it rejected the materialism of Epicurean and Stoicism, that is, their view that reality is exclusively physical, and argued instead that mind is the ultimate basis of reality. The label Neoplatonist is somewhat misleading, for although the thinkers of this movement called themselves Platonists and valued Plato's views more highly than those of other philosophers, they were engaged not simply in reviving and teaching his views, but in making use of them as the basis for their large-scale novel synthesis, drawing creatively on all but the materialist aspects of preceding debates. The two principal doctrines of Neoplatonism are first, that mind is more fundamental than matter, as the philosophical jargon has it, is ontologically prior to matter, which means that it comes first in the order of existence, and second, that the ultimate cause of all things must be a single unitary principle. They held that the cause of anything must contain at least as much, and typically more, reality than its effect, in order to have sufficient causal potency to bring the effect about, and therefore the cause of the universe must be as real or more real than the universe itself. The conjunction of these theses constitutes the basis of Neoplatonism. Since mind is ontologically prior to matter, the ultimate cause of the universe is therefore mind or consciousness, and moreover is a single unitary mind. They regarded this unitary mind as divine and variously called it the One, the First, the Good. It is easy to see why Neoplatonism seemed so attractive to Christians of this period, which is why they were not slow to adopt congenial aspects of it into their metaphysical and moral theology. The immediate metaphysical problem to be addressed by anyone who thinks as the Neoplatonists did about the universe is, how does the material reality that we are familiar with arise from a singular mental consciousness? Neoplatonism's most distinctive features arise from the elaborate and detailed answer it offered to this question. The thinker who is nominated as the founder of Neoplatonism is Plotinus, an Egyptian or Egyptian-born Greek or Roman. He was born in Lycopolis, in Egypt's Nile Delta, in 205 CE, dying 66 years later in Campania in southern Italy. He studied philosophy under Ammonius of Alexandria, going at the age of 40 to Rome, where for a number of years he lectured on Ammonius's teachings. It is said that he began to work out and write down his own views in response to questions his students asked. One of these students, Porphyry, edited Plotinus's writings in 6 books, each containing 9 treatises. The result, therefore, named the Enneads, from the Greek enneia, or 9. The 54 treatises contain much of technical material, and they progress thematically from things earthly to things heavenly, and finally to discussion of the One itself, starting with human goods, the first group of 9 treatises, proceeding to an account of the physical world, groups 2 through 3, and then the soul, group 4, then knowledge and intelligible reality, 5, and finally the One, 6. As already mentioned, Plotinus regarded himself as a follower of Plato's philosophy, but to think that he was straightforwardly so would be misleading. This is first because a great deal had, of course, happened in philosophy since Plato, and Plotinus's Platonism is influenced by the debates criticism, and responses to Plato's views that had accumulated over the intervening 6 centuries. The main targets for his defense and development of Platonism were Aristotle and the Stoics. Secondly, Plotinus accepted the validity of the letters ascribed to Plato and what he knew about the unwritten teachings alluded to by Aristotle, and which Plotinus seems to have known. Moreover, as one would expect from a major philosophical thinker of great powers and creativity, Plotinus's thinking develops Plato. He says things that are Platonic in spirit, but have no actual source in Plato's own writings. This latter fact is unsurprising, given that, for example, there is no single unequivocal theory of forms in Plato. His own self-criticisms leave it open as to what, if anything, he finally decided about the theory. So it is plausible to regard Plotinus's contributions as developments of the intention or spirit of the Platonic theories, if not always their letter. Better still, one can identify what is distinctive about Plotinus's Platonism by saying that it consists in accepting the underlying logic of the Platonic outlook and developing it. For example, the theory of forms rests on the idea that there are eternal truths about perfect, immutable, and eternal entities, and that these have an exemplary or foundational status in relation to what exists in the realm of becoming. They are fully accessible to mind only when mind is disembodied. We recall also that Plato was influenced by Parmenides, who argued that the complexity and plurality cannot be ultimate. Did Plato's unwritten doctrine address this point and hint at or even terminate in a view that reality must ultimately therefore be one? In any event, Plotinus himself took it that Platonism entailed that there must be a first and absolutely simple principle that underlies the appearance of complexity and plurality, and is the embodiment of the eternal truth of things. And this, in essence, is Plotinus's doctrine of the one. We recall that Plato died in 347 BCE, and that the leadership of the academy went first to his nephew Speusippus, and after the latter's death in 339 BCE to Xenocrates. Both of them developed Plato's ideas in ways which, though comprehensibly arising out of them, prompt controversy, most especially in connection with the reduction of the forms to a one and a dyad, this latter being a principle of opposites or multiplicity, as noted earlier. If it is right that there was an unwritten teaching expounded by Plato to his pupils, it is possible that these ideas were aspects of it, providing the seeds for Neoplatonist development centuries later. Philosophical ideas were hot topics in Alexandria in the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, for the city was a lively scene of debate. The Jewish philosopher Philo, Judaeus, from 20 BCE to 50 CE, and Neo-Pythagoreanism both contributed to metaphysical speculation there. Plotinus attended a school of philosophy founded by one Hermias, which during Plotinus's 11 years as a student was headed by Hermias' son, Ammonius Saccas. This person has prompted some speculation among historians of philosophy. Little is known about his doctrines, but he is thought to have been a Christian, at least for a time. Porphyry says that he had been brought up a Christian, but converted to paganism on becoming acquainted with Greek philosophy, a common direction of travel through the ages. Both Eusebius and Jerome deny this, saying that he remained a Christian throughout his life, but they are probably confusing him with someone else of the same name, because his great influence on Plotinus did not make the latter a Christian. There was an Ammonius the Christian who wrote on the Bible. The Christian writer Origen was a pupil of Ammonius of Alexandria also, and he was in turn Eusebius's teacher, which adds to the confusion of the story about Ammonius's relation to Christianity. In fact, Ammonius had 2 pupils called Origen, the other one a pagan. He also taught Herennius and Cassius Longinus. Others speculating on the name Saccas, which suggests that Ammonius had an Indian origin, say that he might have been a second-generation Indian immigrant to Alexandria and had retained elements of the philosophical tradition of his forebears' homeland. This chimes with Porphyry's report that Plotinus had once desired to visit Persia and India in the hope of learning from their philosophers, but was unable to carry out his plan. A 5th century CE account of Ammonius says that his chief tenet was that Plato and Aristotle were in full agreement with each other, given that his most famous pupils, such as Plotinus, Origen the pagan, so called to distinguish him from the Christian Origen, and Longinus, thought of themselves as Platonists in their respective ways. It is plausible that Ammonius had succeeded in persuading them that Plato was right and that Aristotle had not diverged from him. Origen and Longinus were orthodox in their commitment to Middle Platonism, that stage in Platonistic thought after the Academy abandoned the skepticism of the New Academy and modified Plato's doctrines with elements of Aristotelianism and Stoicism. Thus, Middle Platonism occupies the period between the beginning of the 1st century BCE and Plotinus. But Plotinus did not accompany them along that path. He gave a highly original new direction to the Platonic tradition, and it is this that bears the name Neoplatonism. In noting that the occasion and a large part of the platform for Plotinus's views is Plato's thought as modified by Aristotelian and Stoic criticism and by a rejection of materialism, one should add, for a clearer understanding of the development, especially of later Neoplatonism, the influence also of certain mystical ideas from cults such as Orphism and from Judaism, which had come to be more widely known following the translation of a collection of Hebrew scriptures into Demotic or Koine Greek in the text known as the Septuagint, because it is said to have had 70 translators. Septuaginta is Latin for 70. All these factors together contributed to a climate in which Neoplatonism found an increasing receptive audience. As so often happens with important developments in intellectual history, the founder of a tradition of ideas had gifted successors who added to, adapted, or extended it in several directions. In the case of Neoplatonism, the chief successor to Plotinus were Porphyry, from 233 to 305 CE, Iamblichus, from 245 to 325 CE, and Proclus, from 412 to 485 CE. Porphyry had already been mentioned as the compiler of Plotinus's Aeneads. He wrote a commentary on Euclid and a number of other works, whereas he shared with Plotinus the view that rational inquiry is the route to understanding the divine nature of reality. Iamblichus and Proclus are credited with taking Neoplatonism in mystical directions, making it a religious philosophy in which theurgy, the practice of magical rituals to summon deities or to secure their aid, plays a key part. Given that Proclus was head of the Academy in the 5th century CE, one can see how far Plato's doctrines had been taken in the centuries since he had lived. The doctrines of Neoplatonism are elaborate. From the fundamental metaphysical principle of the one, or the first, the universe unfolds into existence in stages in an eternal flow, each stage the ground or principle of the next. Of the one or first, nothing can be said other than it is a unity, and it is absolutely fundamental, for it is beyond being or prior to it. The first activity of the one is consciousness or mind, nous. Nous is the second ultimate ground of being after the one. The self-reflexive understanding that nous has of its source the one produces dualities such as change and rest, greater and smaller, identity and difference, and it produces number, ideas, the forms, and the soul. The soul gazes upon the forms and is affected by them, is informed by them, in such a way that in consequence it produces images of the forms in time and space. These spatio-temporal images of the forms are the physical things that furnish the world. Thus reality is the output of mind or consciousness. Neoplatonism is a species of idealism, the metaphysical view that the ultimate stuff of the universe is mental or non-physical. For Neoplatonists, soul and the nature it produces are on two different levels of a hierarchy, soul on the higher plane and matter on the lower plane. But matter is still an emanation of nous, and therefore partakes of the divine. It is passive, it is the lowest level of reality, it is the terminus of the chain of activities flowing from the one, a penumbra or fringe on the outer limits of existence. Matter is invoked by Plotinus as the explanation of evil. How can there be anything evil in a universe that flows entirely from the one, the good? Yet evil manifestly and tragically exists, so how does it arise? Matter cannot itself be the cause of evil because it is passive, inert, with no powers of its own. Plotinus's ingenious answer is to say that when beings further up the chain of existence, in particular human beings, concentrate on material things below them instead of the higher things above them, evil results. He regarded people as essentially good, but corruptible, and that this is the means of their corruption. His view proved controversial among later Neoplatonists. Proclus devoted a whole treatise to refuting him on this point, arguing that human souls are capable of evil on their own account, a view consistent with the Christian doctrine that people are born sinful because of Adam's fall. Again, that is the doctrine of total depravity within theological circles. Of course, Christian moral theology invoked the idea that the deity gave humankind free will and that this is the source of evil. But the problem for believers in a good God is not quite made to go away by this, for it does not explain such natural evils as the suffering produced by cancer, tsunamis, earthquakes, and the like. Indeed, the problem of evil is one of the most persuasive of the anti-theist arguments, answerable only by conceding that if there are any deities, they are not wholly good or not wholly powerful, or both. The ethics of Neoplatonism constitutes a major source of disagreement between its adherents and Christians, because humans emanate from the one as the source of all being. Neoplatonism says humans are themselves divine or partake of the divine, and the purpose of a life of virtue is to revert to unity with the one. The shortest route to reabsorption into the one is, as one would expect a philosopher to say, the philosophical life devoted to understanding the nature of reality and living in accordance with that understanding. This is par excellence the life of the mind, abjuring things of the body. So far, this rejection of things worldly is consistent with the strenuous version of early Christianity that saw so many of its votaries going to the desert to escape temptation, even in certain cases adopting the extremes of self-castration or living permanently atop a pillar. But the Christian claim that salvation had been achieved for humanity by a one-off self-sacrifice of God in human guise was rejected by Neoplatonists outright. In one version of the Christian view, all you need for salvation is to believe that claim, a very cut-price offer indeed in comparison to the Neoplatonistic view of the universe. The latter transformation of Neoplatonism into a religious practice involving theurgy was in large part a response to the nature of late antiquity, the period of the demise of the Roman Empire in the West, the rise of Christianity, and its vigorous and prolonged assault on paganism, including destruction of the literature and art of the preceding 1,000 years, the existence of many other sects and movements, the hordes of holy men, mystics, and magicians who swarmed that darkening world in competition with each other, which meant that for the purposes of attracting followers, pledges of salvation and the aid of the gods had to be made. The prosperity gospel movements of Christian revivalism in Africa and America are versions of this phenomenon. Philosophical examination of ideas had a hard time competing with bald assertions, claims, miracles, and promises. The more fanciful, the better, a familiar story. For a time, philosophy all but vanished in the swamps of religious claims and practices. Later, Neoplatonism followed down that path. Nevertheless, Neoplatonic ideas proved extraordinarily influential even in this morass, not least perhaps because the morass was itself a part made by them, and most effectively by Proclus. Augustine in Western Christendom, and such figures as Basil and the two fathers named Gregory in Eastern Christendom, were influenced by Neoplatonist ideas, as was the theology developed in later medieval times by Thomas Aquinas and others. When the Arab conquest began in the 7th century CE, the regions of Eastern Christendom where Greek philosophy still survived, chiefly Syria and Mediterranean Egypt, immediately influenced thinking in the expanding Islamic world. In the Renaissance rediscovery of Greek philosophy, Neoplatonism was what Plato meant to the greatly influential Marsilio Ficino, and through him to the culture of the day, and its later theurgic elements fed the flames of interest in magic, Hermeticism, the Kabbalah, and other mystical movements in the 16th century CE, in lands that the Reformation had made Protestant, and where therefore religious authority was insufficiently strong to keep the explosion of such interest down. In all forms of idealism in modern and contemporary philosophy, traces of Neoplatonism remain. The Neoplatonism is not the only example of a philosophy that was transformed over time into a religion. The same happened to Buddhism, Jainism, and Confucianism, which are strictly not religious because they lack a god or gods. The more popular versions of Buddhism have become submerged beneath layers of supernaturalism of various kinds. Two elements in human nature, the propensity to superstition and the hunger for simple stories to provide a framework for some sort of understanding of the universe and one's place in it, are powerful in explaining how this happens.